In a quiet little town in Texas, where the sun baked the cracked roads and tumbleweeds rolled lazily across empty fields, there lived a man named John Anderson. John wasn't someone who stood out in a crowd. He was an ordinary man with an ordinary job, working as a mechanic at a small garage on the edge of town. His hands were always stained with grease and his jeans bore patches from years of hard work. But despite his unassuming appearance, John had something about him that made people notice: his deep faith. It wasn't just something he talked about. It was woven into every part of his life. Every morning before heading to work, John would spend a few minutes sitting quietly by himself, reading passages from the Bible. It was his way of starting the day with clarity and purpose. At the garage, he kept a worn-out copy of the good book tucked away in his toolbox. Whenever he had a spare moment between fixing cars, he'd pull it out and read a verse or two. His co-workers knew better than to interrupt him during these moments. They didn't always share his beliefs, but they respected him because he was kind, honest, and hardworking. And while some might have found his devotion unusual, no one ever questioned it, until one fateful day when everything changed. On the back window of John's old pickup truck, which he used to drive to and from work, there was a simple decal: Jesus saves. The sticker wasn't large or flashy. It was just a plain white message written in bold black letters. To John, it wasn't just decoration. It was a declaration of what mattered most to him. For years, the decal stayed there without causing any trouble. People saw it, nodded, and moved on. In this small town, everyone knew each other, and nobody thought twice about John's choice to display his faith so openly. It was simply part of who he was, like his love for country music or the cowboy boots he wore almost every day. But then, things began to shift. One afternoon, as John drove home after a long day at the garage, he noticed flashing red and blue lights in his rearview mirror. Confused, he slowed down and pulled over onto the shoulder of the road. He hadn't been speeding, hadn't run a stop sign, and certainly hadn't done anything reckless. When the officer approached his window, John rolled it down with a puzzled expression. "Evening, officer," he said politely, squinting against the setting sun. "Is there a problem?" The officer glanced briefly at John's license and registration before pointing toward the back window of the truck. "That sticker, you're going to need to remove it," he said matter-of-factly. John followed the officer's gaze and felt his stomach drop. "You mean my Jesus Saves decal?" he asked, incredulous. The officer nodded. "There's a new ordinance in place," he explained. "No religious messages allowed on vehicles. It's considered offensive to others." John stared at the officer, dumbfounded. Offensive? How could those two words offend anyone? He opened his mouth to protest, to explain that the decal represented his belief system, his values, his very identity, but the officer cut him off. "I'm sorry, sir, but I have to issue you a citation unless you remove it right now." John hesitated, torn between compliance and defiance. Finally, he sighed and accepted the ticket, feeling a mix of frustration and confusion bubbling inside him. That night, sitting alone in his modest kitchen, John couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. The ticket lay on the table in front of him, its official stamp glaring up at him like a challenge. Outside, crickets chirped, and the occasional car passed by on the nearby highway. The house was silent except for the faint hum of the refrigerator. John leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his graying hair. This wasn't just about a sticker anymore. It felt personal, as if someone had told him he couldn't be himself in public. Growing up, John had learned to value freedom above all else. His father, a veteran, often spoke about the sacrifices made to protect individual liberties. Freedom means you can say what you believe, live how you want, and worship however you choose, his dad would say. Those lessons stuck with John throughout his life, shaping the way he saw the world. Now here he was, being told that displaying his faith, a core part of who he was, wasn't acceptable. Something about that didn't sit right with him. As the hours ticked by, John's frustration turned into resolve. He wasn't going to let this go. He decided to fight the citation, not just for himself, but for the principle behind it. If he gave in now, what message would that send? Would it mean that people could silence your beliefs just because someone else disagreed? That thought gnawed at him. He wanted to stand up for what he believed in, even if it meant facing consequences. The next morning, John arrived at the garage earlier than usual. As he worked on a rusty sedan, his mind kept drifting back to the ticket. During his lunch break, he called a friend who had studied law in college. "Hey, Mark," he said, trying to sound casual despite the knot in his stomach. "Can I ask you something? What do you know about free speech laws?" Mark listened patiently as John explained the situation. By the end of the conversation, John felt slightly more hopeful. Maybe there was a way to fight this. Maybe the law was on his side. News of John's encounter spread quickly around town. Small towns are like that. Everyone knows everyone, and gossip travels faster than wildfire. Some folks supported John, patting him on the back and telling him he was doing the right thing. "You can't let them push you around," one neighbor said firmly. Others weren't so sure. Over coffee at the local diner, debates erupted about whether religious messages belonged in public spaces. "It's not hurting anybody," argued Mrs. Thompson, the church organist. "Why should it bother anyone?" But Mr. Harris, the high school science teacher, shook his head. "Not everyone shares those beliefs," he countered. "Public spaces should be neutral." Despite the differing opinions, one thing was clear. John's refusal to remove the decal had sparked something bigger than anyone anticipated. What started as a routine traffic stop had become a topic of heated discussion, dividing the town into factions. Even the local newspaper ran a story about it, complete with quotes from both sides. Suddenly, John found himself at the center of a controversy he hadn't asked for. Strangers stopped him on the street to voice their opinions, and late-night phone calls came from people offering advice or criticism. Through it all, John tried to stay focused. This wasn't about winning arguments or proving people wrong. It was about standing firm in his convictions and showing the world that freedom meant having the courage to express who you truly are. As days turned into weeks, John prepared for his court appearance. He practiced explaining his perspective, rehearsing his arguments until they felt natural. He reminded himself why he was doing this, not for attention or recognition, but because he believed in the importance of living authentically. No matter what happened next, he knew he had already taken the first step toward making a difference. John's first day in court felt like stepping into a completely different world. The courtroom was cold and formal, with rows of wooden benches polished to a shine. A large American flag hung on the wall behind the judge's seat, its colors bright against the dull gray walls. John sat nervously in the front row, his hands clasped tightly together. He wore his best shirt, a slightly wrinkled button-up he'd borrowed from his brother, and his boots squeaked softly as he shifted in his seat. Around him, the room buzzed with quiet murmurs. Some people had come out of curiosity, while others were there to support John or oppose him. Either way, all eyes seemed to be on him. When the judge entered, everyone stood up. The judge, an older man with thinning gray hair and glasses perched on the bridge of his nose, took his seat and called for order. John's heart pounded as the proceedings began. His lawyer, a young woman named Sarah who had agreed to take the case pro bono, stood up to speak. She explained that the ordinance banning religious messages on vehicles violated John's First Amendment rights. Freedom of speech isn't just about saying what you want, she argued. It's also about expressing your beliefs without fear of punishment. Her voice was calm but firm, and John nodded along as she spoke, feeling a flicker of hope. The opposing side, representing the county, presented their argument next. Their lawyer, a tall man in a sharp suit, emphasized the need for public spaces to remain neutral. Allowing religious messages creates division, he said. Not everyone shares these views, and forcing them to encounter such expressions daily infringes on their comfort and rights. John listened carefully, trying to understand their point of view, but it still didn't sit right with him. Why should his freedom to express his faith be limited because someone else might disagree? He glanced at the audience and saw mixed reactions, some nodding in agreement with the county's lawyer, others shaking their heads in disbelief. After both sides finished presenting their cases, the judge announced that he would take some time to consider the matter before making a decision. As John left the courtroom, he felt a strange mix of emotions. On one hand, he was proud of himself for standing up and speaking out. On the other hand, he couldn't shake the uncertainty of what might happen next. Would the judge rule in his favor, or would he lose, leaving the ordinance intact and setting a dangerous precedent for others like him? Back home, the attention only grew stronger. Local news stations covered the trial extensively, turning John's quiet life upside down. Reporters camped outside his house, waiting for a chance to interview him. Neighbors stopped by unannounced, eager to share their thoughts or ask questions. Even strangers approached him at the grocery store, sometimes offering words of encouragement, other times criticizing his actions. One afternoon, while buying milk, a man leaned over and whispered, "You're stirring up trouble for nothing." John forced a polite smile and walked away, clutching the cart tighter than necessary. Despite the chaos, John tried to keep things normal. He went to work every morning, fixing cars and chatting with customers as if nothing had changed. But even there, the topic followed him. Some clients brought it up casually, asking how the trial was going. Others avoided mentioning it altogether, perhaps unsure of where they stood. At lunch breaks, his co-workers debated the issue passionately, each side presenting their arguments. "If we let this slide, soon they'll ban Christmas trees too," joked Pete, one of the mechanics. Everyone laughed, but beneath the humor lay a real concern about where the line should be drawn. As weeks passed, John found himself reflecting more deeply on why he cared so much about this case. It wasn't just about the decal on his truck. It was about something bigger. Growing up, his parents had taught him the importance of standing up for what you believe in, no matter how unpopular it might seem. They often told stories of civil rights activists and pioneers who fought for justice despite overwhelming odds. Now, sitting alone in his kitchen late at night, John realized he was following in their footsteps. This wasn't just about him, it was about protecting the freedoms that made his country special. One evening, after another long day, John received a call from Sarah, his lawyer. She sounded excited. "We've got some good news," she said. "A national civil liberties organization has offered to help us with your case. They think it could set an important legal precedent." John's heart raced. He had heard of the organization before. They were known for taking on high-profile cases involving constitutional rights. If they were getting involved, it meant his fight was about to get much bigger. "Are you okay with this?" Sarah asked cautiously. "It'll bring even more attention, but it could make a real difference." John didn't hesitate. "Yes," he replied firmly. "Let's do it." He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but he also knew he couldn't back down now. This wasn't just about winning or losing anymore. It was about sending a message that people shouldn't have to hide who they are. With the new legal team on board, preparations intensified. Lawyers pored over documents, researching similar cases and crafting strategies. They held meetings at John's house, spreading papers across his dining table and discussing every possible angle. For John, it was overwhelming but exhilarating. He learned more about the law than he ever thought he would, gaining a deeper appreciation for the complexities of freedom and expression. Yet through it all, he remained grounded, reminding himself of the simple reason he started this journey: to protect his right to live authentically. The media frenzy reached new heights once the national organization joined the case. Journalists from across the country descended on the small Texas town, eager to capture the story of the mechanic fighting for his faith. Television crews set up cameras outside the courthouse, and newspapers published editorials debating the merits of John's stance. People from all walks of life weighed in, flooding social media platforms with opinions. Some praised John as a champion of free speech, while others accused him of pushing religion into public spaces unnecessarily. The divide grew wider, mirroring the broader cultural tensions simmering beneath the surface. Through it all, John stayed focused. He gave interviews when asked, always speaking calmly and respectfully. He avoided attacking those who disagreed with him, instead emphasizing the importance of protecting individual freedoms. "I'm not trying to force anyone to believe what I believe," he told one reporter. "I just want the right to express my faith without being punished for it." His words resonated with many, drawing even more supporters to his cause. As the trial date approached, John felt a mix of nerves and determination. He knew the outcome would have far-reaching implications, not just for him, but for countless others facing similar challenges. Each morning he woke up early, prayed silently, and reminded himself why he was doing this. It wasn't for fame or recognition. It was for the principle of living freely and openly, without fear of censorship or judgment. And though the pressure mounted, John held on to that belief, knowing it would guide him through whatever came next. The day of the trial finally arrived, and John woke up before sunrise, his mind racing with thoughts about what was to come. He stood by the window in his kitchen, watching the first light of dawn creep over the horizon. Outside, the world seemed calm, but inside, his heart was pounding like a drum. Today wasn't just another court appearance. It felt like the culmination of everything he had fought for over the past months. As he sipped his coffee, he replayed Sarah's advice in his head. Stay calm, stick to your truth, and let the law speak for itself. Simple words, but they carried weight. By the time he reached the courthouse, a crowd had already gathered. Reporters jostled for position near the entrance, their cameras clicking furiously as people walked in and out. Supporters held signs that read "Free Speech Matters" and "Stand for Faith," while opponents chanted slogans about separation of church and state. The air buzzed with energy, a mix of excitement and tension. John took a deep breath and stepped out of his truck, feeling the weight of all those eyes on him. For a moment he hesitated, wondering if he was truly ready for this. But then he remembered why he was here, not for himself, but for the principle of freedom, and he straightened his shoulders, walking steadily toward the building. Inside, the courtroom was packed. Every seat was taken, and latecomers lined the walls, craning their necks to see what was happening. Lawyers shuffled papers, whispering urgently to one another. The judge entered, and the room fell silent. John sat at the front, flanked by his legal team, who exchanged confident glances. They had prepared tirelessly for this moment, and now it was time to put their arguments to the test. As the proceedings began, John listened intently, his hands gripping the edge of the table so tightly that his knuckles turned white. Sarah opened the case by laying out the core issue. The ordinance banning religious messages violated the First Amendment. She spoke passionately, her voice steady and clear. "This isn't just about a sticker on a truck," she said, gesturing toward John. "It's about the right to express your beliefs freely without government interference. If we allow laws like this to stand, where does it end? Who decides which messages are acceptable and which aren't?" Her words resonated with many in the room, drawing nods of agreement from John's supporters. The opposing counsel countered with equal fervor. Their argument centered on the idea of public neutrality. Public spaces must remain inclusive, the lawyer argued, pacing back and forth. Religious expressions can alienate those who don't share the same beliefs. Allowing such displays opens the door to divisiveness and conflict. He painted a picture of chaos, suggesting that unchecked free expression could lead to societal unrest. Some in the audience murmured in agreement, swayed by the logic of maintaining order over individual freedoms. Throughout the arguments, John watched the judge closely, searching for any sign of how he might rule. The judge listened patiently, his face unreadable, occasionally jotting notes on a pad. When it came time for John to testify, his stomach churned with nerves. Standing up, he walked slowly to the witness stand, feeling the weight of dozens of eyes on him. His palms were sweaty and his throat felt dry, but he reminded himself to stay calm. This was his chance to explain why this fight mattered so much. Under questioning from Sarah, John recounted the events leading up to the citation and described what the decal meant to him. "It's not just a sticker," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "It represents my faith, my values, and who I am as a person. Telling me to remove it feels like telling me to hide part of myself. That's not freedom. That's censorship." His honesty struck a chord with many in the room, even some who had initially been skeptical of his stance. When the opposing counsel cross-examined him, challenging whether his message infringed on others' rights. John stayed composed. "I'm not forcing anyone to believe what I believe," he replied firmly. "I'm simply sharing what matters, most to me." As the trial wore on, the atmosphere in the courtroom grew tense. Each side presented expert witnesses, citing constitutional precedents and legal theories. Lawyers debated the nuances of free speech versus public accommodation, dissecting definitions and interpretations until the lines blurred. John struggled to follow every detail, but he understood the essence of the arguments. Was it fair to restrict personal expression in the name of neutrality? Or did doing so infringe on fundamental freedoms? Finally, after hours of deliberation, the judge announced that he would need more time to reach a verdict. The courtroom erupted into murmurs of disappointment and anticipation. John exhaled deeply, feeling both relieved and anxious. At least the waiting was almost over. As he left the courthouse, reporters swarmed him again, firing questions about how he felt and what he thought would happen next. John answered as best he could, repeating his belief in the importance of standing up for freedom. Inside, though, he couldn't shake the uncertainty gnawing at him. Back home, the attention only intensified. National news outlets picked up the story, turning John's battle into a symbol of broader cultural debates. Social media exploded with hashtags supporting or opposing him, and opinion pieces flooded newspapers across the country. People sent letters to his house, some filled with encouragement, others brimming with anger. One envelope contained a handwritten note that read, "You're making us proud," while another held a scathing critique calling him selfish and divisive. John read them all, letting each perspective sink in. It was overwhelming, but he reminded himself that controversy often accompanied change. Despite the whirlwind around him, John tried to maintain a sense of normalcy. He went to work as usual, fixing cars and chatting with customers. Yet everywhere he turned, the topic followed him. Strangers approached him at gas stations asking for autographs or berating him for stirring up trouble. Friends called to offer support, while acquaintances avoided eye contact, unsure of where they stood. Even at church, where he had once blended seamlessly into the congregation, people whispered about him during sermons. Some admired his courage, others worried he was attracting too much negative attention. One evening, after a particularly grueling day, John sat on his porch staring at the stars. The cool night air offered a brief reprieve from the chaos. His dog lay at his feet, panting softly, and the distant hum of crickets provided a soothing backdrop. For the first time in weeks, he allowed himself to reflect quietly. What if he lost? Would all this effort have been for nothing? And if he won, would it really make a difference? These questions swirled in his mind, leaving him restless. But then he thought about his father, who had always emphasized the value of perseverance. "Sometimes you don't win because you expect immediate results," his dad used to say. "You win because you plant seeds that grow long after you're gone." Those words brought John comfort. Whether he succeeded or failed, he knew he had sparked a conversation about freedom and expression, a conversation that needed to happen. That realization gave him strength, reminding him that the fight wasn't just about him. It was about something bigger. A few days later, Sarah called with an update. The judge had issued his ruling. The ordinance was unconstitutional. Religious messages, like any other form of expression, were protected under the First Amendment. John froze, the phone slipping slightly in his hand. Victory. After months of uncertainty, the decision was finally in his favor. Tears welled up in his eyes as he thanked Sarah, his voice cracking with emotion. This wasn't just a win for him, it was a victory for everyone who believed in the power of free expression. The news spread quickly, igniting celebrations among his supporters and sparking outrage among critics. Television anchors analyzed the implications of the ruling, predicting how it might shape future cases. Legal experts praised the decision as a landmark moment for First Amendment rights, while opponents vowed to appeal or push for new legislation. Amid the noise, John remained grounded, focusing on the simple fact that he had stood firm in his convictions, and it had made a difference. That night, sitting alone in his kitchen, John looked at the ticket that had started it all. The piece of paper seemed insignificant now, yet it represented so much more than a fine. It was proof that ordinary people could challenge injustice and inspire change. As he placed it back in a drawer, he smiled faintly, knowing his journey was far from over. The decal on his truck still bore the message "Jesus saves," but to John it now carried an additional meaning. Freedom lives. The ruling sent shockwaves through the small Texas town and beyond. It wasn't just a local story anymore. It had become national news, sparking debates in households, schools, and workplaces across the country. For John Anderson, the mechanic, whose quiet life had been upended by a simple decal on his truck, the aftermath was both exhilarating and overwhelming. Every time he stepped outside, people recognized him. Some clapped him on the back, calling him a hero for standing up for free speech. Others glared at him, muttering under their breath about how he'd pushed religion into places it didn't belong. Despite the mixed reactions, one thing was clear. John's case had ignited a conversation that couldn't be ignored. At first, John tried to keep living as normally as possible. He went to work every day, fixing cars and chatting with customers, like always. But even there, things felt different. Clients who once talked to him only about oil changes or brake pads now asked his opinion on constitutional law. "So what's next for you?" they'd ask, as if he were some kind of legal expert instead of a guy who worked with wrenches and grease. John smiled politely, explaining that he was just trying to get back to his routine. Deep down, though, he knew nothing would ever be the same. His name was attached to a landmark decision, and whether he liked it or not, people saw him as a symbol of something bigger than himself. The media attention reached new heights after the verdict. Reporters from major networks descended on the town, eager to capture sound bites from the man behind the case. Television crews set up cameras outside John's garage, waiting for him to take a break so they could shove microphones in his face. At home, his phone rang constantly with interview requests. Talk shows invited him to share his story, and magazines wanted to feature him on their covers. John accepted some of these opportunities, knowing it was important to explain his perspective, but he turned down most of them. He didn't want fame. He just wanted people to understand why he'd fought so hard. During one televised interview, a journalist asked him directly, "Do you think this ruling will divide people even more?" John paused, thinking carefully, before answering. "Maybe," he admitted. "But I also think it's okay to have disagreements. What's not okay is telling someone they can't express who they are. That's what this fight was about. For me, anyway." His words resonated with many viewers, drawing praise from those who agreed with him and criticism from those who didn't. Social media lit up with hashtags like "Mar Freedom for All" and "Nar Keep It Neutral," reflecting the ongoing divide. As weeks turned into months, the frenzy began to die down. Reporters stopped camping outside John's house, and strangers no longer approached him in grocery store aisles. Life slowly returned to a semblance of normalcy, though reminders of the trial lingered. Friends still joked about his 15 minutes of fame, and coworkers teased him good-naturedly about becoming a celebrity. Even his old truck, with its now famous decal, drew occasional honks and thumbs-ups from passing drivers. John appreciated the support, but he often found himself longing for the days when he could simply blend into the background. Despite the chaos, John couldn't deny that the experience had changed him. He had started out as an ordinary mechanic, content to live quietly and practice his faith without fanfare. Now he was part of a larger movement, a voice in a national conversation about freedom, expression, and tolerance. It was humbling and sometimes intimidating, but it also gave him a sense of purpose. He realized that while he hadn't sought out this role, he could use it to make a difference. Whether speaking at community events or writing letters to lawmakers, John embraced opportunities to advocate for individual liberties. One evening, during a quiet moment at home, John flipped through a stack of letters he'd received since the trial. Some were filled with gratitude, thanking him for standing up for what he believed in. One woman wrote, "Your courage inspired me to speak my truth, even when it's hard." Another letter came from a teenager who said, "You showed me that anyone can make a difference no matter where they come from." These messages touched John deeply, reinforcing his belief that the fight had been worth it. Not everyone agreed with him, of course. Some letters contained harsh criticism, accusing him of forcing his beliefs on others. But John read them all, taking each perspective seriously. Amid the attention, John remained grounded by focusing on the values that had guided him from the start. Faith, family, and community were the pillars of his life, and he refused to let anything distract him from them. Sundays were still reserved for church, where he worshiped alongside friends and neighbors. Weeknights often involved barbecues, or game nights with his kids, laughter filling the air as they played board games or told silly jokes. These moments reminded John of what truly mattered, anchoring him during the whirlwind of public scrutiny. The legal victory also brought practical changes. In towns and cities nationwide, similar ordinances banning religious expressions were challenged and overturned. Schools began incorporating John's case into civics lessons, teaching students about the balance between personal freedoms and societal norms. Community leaders held forums to discuss how to foster inclusivity without stifling diversity. While opinions remained divided, the dialogue itself marked progress, a step toward understanding rather than division. For John, the most rewarding outcome was seeing others find courage in his example. A young teacher in another state reached out to tell him she had displayed a small cross in her classroom, despite fears of backlash. "Your story made me realize I shouldn't have to hide my faith," she wrote. "Thank you for paving the way." Stories like hers reminded John that his actions had ripple effects, inspiring people to stand firm in their own convictions. Still, not everything was positive. Critics continued to argue that allowing religious messages in public spaces marginalized non-religious individuals. They pointed to instances where such displays sparked tension or conflict, insisting that neutrality was essential for harmony. John listened to these concerns, recognizing the validity of differing viewpoints. He didn't claim to have all the answers, but he believed strongly that freedom meant embracing complexity, even discomfort, as part of the human experience. Months later, John attended a conference hosted by the Civil Liberties Organization that had supported his case. Speakers from various backgrounds discussed the intersection of faith, freedom, and public policy. As he sat in the audience, John reflected on how far he'd come. Just a year ago, he'd been an ordinary mechanic trying to pay his bills. Now, he was sitting among lawyers, activists, and scholars, contributing to conversations that shaped the nation's future. It was surreal, but also deeply fulfilling. Toward the end of the conference, John was invited to speak. Standing at the podium, he looked out at the crowd, feeling a mix of nerves and pride. "I never set out to change the world," he began, his voice steady. "I just wanted to live authentically, without fear of punishment for expressing my beliefs. But along the way, I learned something important, that freedom isn't free. It requires courage, sacrifice, and a willingness to stand up for what's right, even when it's hard." The room erupted in applause, and John felt a lump rise in his throat. This wasn't about him. It was about the collective effort to protect the rights of everyone, regardless of their beliefs. Back home, life settled into a new rhythm. The spotlight faded, leaving John to reflect on the journey he'd taken. He still drove his old truck, its "Jesus Saves" decal proudly displayed on the rear window. To him, it wasn't just a sticker anymore. It was a reminder of resilience, conviction, and the power of standing firm in the face of adversity. And though he knew challenges lay ahead, he faced them with renewed confidence, knowing he had already proven that even ordinary people could spark extraordinary change. Months passed, and the dust began to settle around John Anderson's life. The whirlwind of media attention and public debate had quieted, leaving behind a sense of reflection. For John, it was both a relief and a challenge. On one hand, he was grateful for the return to normalcy. No more reporters knocking on his door or strangers staring at him in the grocery store. On the other hand, he couldn't shake the feeling that his journey wasn't truly over. The court ruling may have been final, but its impact continued to ripple outward, touching lives far beyond his small Texas town. At work, things slowly returned to how they used to be. Customers came in with their broken-down cars, chatting about football games or complaining about rising gas prices. Yet every now and then someone would bring up the trial, asking John if he ever imagined his case would become so big. He'd laugh and shrug, saying, "Not in a million years." But deep down, he knew the experience had changed him. It wasn't just about winning a legal battle. It was about realizing the power of standing up for what you believe in, even when it feels like the odds are against you. One afternoon, while tightening bolts under the hood of an old pickup truck, John overheard two customers talking near the counter. One man said, "You know, I didn't agree with him at first. Thought he was stirring up trouble, but now I think maybe we need more people like him, people willing to fight for freedom even if it makes others uncomfortable." The words stopped John mid-task. He peeked out from under the car, watching as the men nodded thoughtfully. It struck him then. The real victory wasn't just in the courtroom. It was in changing hearts and minds, sparking conversations that might never have happened otherwise. Despite the fading spotlight, reminders of the trial popped up unexpectedly. Teachers across the country started using John's story in classrooms, teaching students about the First Amendment and the importance of protecting individual rights. Civics teachers sent letters thanking him for providing such a vivid example of democracy in action. "Your case helps kids understand that laws aren't just abstract ideas, they affect real people," one educator wrote. Reading those notes filled John with pride, knowing his struggle had inspired young minds to think critically about freedom and responsibility. But not everyone viewed John's victory through rose-colored glasses. Critics still argued that allowing religious expressions in public spaces alienated those who didn't share the same beliefs. Online forums buzzed with debates, some accusing John of prioritizing his faith over inclusivity. Others pointed to instances where similar displays had sparked tension, insisting that neutrality was key to maintaining harmony. John read these comments carefully, acknowledging the validity of their concerns. He didn't claim to have all the answers, but he believed deeply in the principle of coexistence, that differences could exist side by side without erasing each other. To address these tensions, John began attending community forums and panel discussions, sharing his perspective while listening to others. At one event, a woman stood up and said, "I respect your courage, Mr. Anderson, but I worry that cases like yours make non-religious people feel excluded. Where do we draw the line?" John nodded, appreciating her honesty. "That's a fair question," he replied. "And I don't think there's a perfect answer. What I do believe is that freedom means making room for everyone, even when it's messy. If we silence one group to protect another, we risk losing something essential." His willingness to engage in dialogue earned him respect, even from those who disagreed with him. Over time, John became known not just as the mechanic who fought for his decal, but as a voice of reason in polarized times. People admired his ability to stay calm and respectful, even when faced with hostility. His approach reminded them that disagreement didn't have to mean division, that progress often came from uncomfortable conversations. As the months rolled on, John found himself invited to speak at events far beyond his hometown. Universities, churches, and civic organizations reached out, eager to hear his story. At first he hesitated, unsure if he was the right person to represent such weighty issues. But Sarah, his lawyer-turned-friend, encouraged him. "You're not speaking because you have all the answers," she said. "You're speaking because your story shows what's possible when ordinary people stand up for their beliefs." Her words gave John the confidence to step onto stages he never imagined he'd occupy. One evening, after delivering a speech at a college auditorium, a young man approached John with tears in his eyes. "Thank you," he said softly. "I've been scared to express my own beliefs, worried about being judged or shut down. Hearing your story gives me hope." Moments like these reinforced John's decision to keep sharing his experience. He realized that his fight wasn't just about a sticker on a truck. It was about empowering others to live authentically, unafraid of judgment or rejection. Back home, John balanced his newfound role as a public figure with the demands of everyday life. Weekends were spent coaching his son's Little League team, cheering loudly from the sidelines as the boys swung at pitches and slid into bases. Evenings were reserved for family dinners, laughter filling the kitchen as plates clinked, and stories unfolded. These moments grounded him, reminding him of what truly mattered. Fame, or whatever version of it he'd experienced, couldn't replace the joy of simple, meaningful connections. Still, the lingering effects of the trial occasionally caught him off guard. Once, while pumping gas, a stranger leaned out of his car window and shouted, "Hey, aren't you that Jesus guy?" John chuckled and waved, used to the random encounters by now. Another time, a local bookstore owner handed him a copy of a magazine featuring his face on the cover. "Thought, you might want this," she said with a grin. John accepted it graciously, tucking it away without much fanfare. To him, these moments weren't trophies to be displayed. They were reminders of the unexpected paths life could take. What surprised John most was how the trial had strengthened his faith. Throughout the process, he had relied heavily on prayer and scripture, finding comfort in the belief that he wasn't alone. Winning the case hadn't changed his convictions. If anything, it deepened them. He saw God's hand in the outcome, not as a reward for righteousness, but as a testament to perseverance and trust. Each morning, he continued his quiet routine of reading the Bible, drawing strength from its words as he navigated the complexities of post-trial life. The broader cultural conversation sparked by his case showed no signs of slowing down. Lawmakers debated new legislation aimed at balancing free expression with public accommodation. Advocacy groups launched campaigns to educate communities about the importance of diversity and tolerance. Schools held essay contests asking students to reflect on the meaning of freedom in modern society. Everywhere John looked, he saw evidence of the dialogue he had helped ignite. A dialogue that transcended politics, religion, and geography. Yet amidst the larger narrative, John remained focused on the personal. He understood that true change happened not in grand gestures but in small, consistent actions. Whether mentoring a young mechanic at the garage or volunteering at the local food bank, he sought ways to contribute quietly and meaningfully. His philosophy was simple: lead by example. If people saw him living out his values, kindness, humility, and integrity, they might be inspired to do the same. By the end of the year, John felt a renewed sense of peace. The chaos of the trial had taught him valuable lessons about resilience, empathy, and the complexity of human beliefs. He had learned that standing up for freedom wasn't about silencing opposition, but about creating space for diverse voices to coexist. And while he knew challenges lay ahead, he faced them with unwavering optimism, confident that the principles he fought for would endure. Driving home one crisp December evening, John glanced at the rear window of his truck. The Jesus Saves decal still gleamed brightly, its message unchanged. To anyone else, it might have seemed like just a sticker. To John, it was a symbol of everything he had fought for, a reminder that freedom wasn't just a privilege, but a responsibility. As he pulled into his driveway and turned off the engine, he smiled faintly, knowing he had done his part to protect it. Whatever the future held, he was ready. As the years passed, John Anderson's life settled into a rhythm that felt both familiar and new. The spotlight had dimmed, but its effects lingered in subtle ways. People still recognized him occasionally, at church, at the gas station, or during Little League games, but the attention was no longer overwhelming. Instead, it came as gentle nods of respect or kind words from strangers who remembered his story. For John, this quieter existence suited him just fine. He didn't crave fame or recognition. What mattered most was knowing he had made a difference. Adam, work. John continued fixing cars with the same dedication he always had. His hands were calloused from years of turning wrenches, but they moved with practiced ease. Customers trusted him not only because of his skill, but also because of the integrity he brought to every job. Some even joked that bringing their vehicles to John felt like contributing to a legacy. "You're not just a mechanic," one customer said with a grin. "You're a symbol of standing up for what's right." John laughed it off, though secretly, The comment touched him. To think that his name could mean something beyond grease-stained overalls amazed him. The lessons John learned during the trial stayed with him, shaping how he interacted with others. He became more patient, more willing to listen, especially when disagreements arose. At family gatherings, debates about politics or religion sometimes grew heated, but John never raised his voice. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, sipped his coffee, and let others speak before offering his thoughts. "We don't have to agree on everything," he'd say calmly, "but we can still treat each other with respect." His approach earned admiration, even from relatives who held opposing views. In the wider world, the impact of John's case continued to unfold. Schools across the nation incorporated his story into their curricula, teaching students about the First Amendment and the importance of protecting individual freedoms. Civics teachers praised the case as a real-world example of constitutional principles in action. Textbooks featured sidebars about John's trial, describing how an ordinary mechanic sparked a landmark legal decision. Students wrote essays reflecting on the balance between free expression and societal harmony, often citing John's courage as inspiration. For John, these developments brought a mix of pride and humility. He was honored that his experience resonated with so many people, yet he never saw himself as extraordinary. When asked about it, he'd shrug and say, "I was just doing what I thought was right. Anyone else in my shoes might have done the same." This perspective endeared him to those around him, reinforcing the idea that heroism wasn't about grandeur. It was about ordinary people making brave choices. Not everyone viewed John's victory positively, however. Critics argued that allowing religious messages in public spaces created divisions, rather than unity. They pointed to instances where similar displays sparked protests or lawsuits, insisting that neutrality was essential for maintaining peace. Social media buzzed with heated discussions, some accusing John of forcing his beliefs onto others. While these criticisms stung, John refused to respond with anger. Instead, he listened carefully, acknowledging the validity of differing perspectives. "Freedom means making room for everyone, even when it's uncomfortable," he often said. His willingness to engage respectfully won over skeptics, proving that dialogue could bridge divides. Over time, John embraced opportunities to share his story in meaningful ways. He spoke at conferences, universities, and community events, encouraging audiences to stand firm in their convictions while respecting the rights of others. His speeches weren't polished or rehearsed. They were heartfelt reflections on faith, freedom, and the power of perseverance. Listeners walked away inspired, not because John promised easy answers, but because he reminded them that change begins with ordinary actions. One memorable evening, after delivering a talk at a high school graduation ceremony, a student approached John with tears streaming down her face. "I've been afraid to show who I really am," she confessed. "Your story makes me realize I shouldn't hide my beliefs just because someone might disagree." John placed a hand on her shoulder, his voice steady and reassuring. "It's okay to be scared," he said. "But remember this. Living authentically is worth it, even if it's hard." Moments like these reinforced why he kept sharing his journey. Not for accolades, but to empower others to embrace their truths. Back home, John cherished the simplicity of everyday life. Weekends were spent coaching his son's baseball team, cheering loudly from the sidelines as kids swung bats and slid into bases. Evenings revolved around family dinners, laughter filling the kitchen as plates clinked and stories unfolded. These moments grounded him, reminding him that behind every headline and courtroom drama lay the quiet joys of connection and love. The broader cultural conversation sparked by John's case showed no signs of slowing down. Lawmakers debated policies aimed at balancing free expression with inclusivity. Advocacy groups launched campaigns promoting tolerance and understanding. Communities organized forums to discuss how to navigate differences without erasing them. Everywhere John looked, he saw evidence of the dialogue he had helped ignite, a dialogue that transcended boundaries of politics, religion, and geography. Yet, amidst the larger narrative, John remained focused on the personal. He understood that true change happened not through grand gestures, but through small, consistent actions. Whether mentoring young mechanics at the garage or volunteering at the local food bank, he sought ways to contribute quietly and meaningfully. His philosophy was simple: lead by example. If people saw him living out his values, kindness, humility, and integrity, they might be inspired to do the same. By the end of the decade, John felt a deep sense of fulfillment. The chaos of the trial had taught him valuable lessons about resilience, empathy, and the complexity of human beliefs. He had learned that standing up for freedom wasn't about silencing opposition, but about creating space for diverse voices to coexist. And while he knew challenges lay ahead, he faced them with unwavering optimism, confident that the principles he fought for would endure. Driving home one crisp autumn evening, John glanced at the rear window of his truck. The "Jesus Saves" decal still gleamed brightly, its message unchanged. To anyone else, it might have seemed like just a sticker. To John, it was a symbol of everything he had fought for, a reminder that freedom wasn't just a privilege, but a responsibility. As he pulled into his driveway and turned off the engine, he smiled faintly, knowing he had done his part to protect it. That night, sitting alone on his porch, John reflected on the journey he had taken. From a routine traffic stop to a national debate about freedom, his life had transformed in ways he never imagined. Yet despite the accolades and controversies, he remained the same man at heart, a mechanic with a deep faith and a commitment to living authentically. The road ahead might hold uncertainties, but John faced them with courage, knowing he had already proven that even ordinary people could spark extraordinary change. As the stars twinkled above, John leaned back in his chair, listening to the distant hum of crickets. Life had returned to normal, yet nothing felt quite the same. The trial had left an indelible mark, not just on him, but on countless others whose lives had been touched by his story. And as he sat there, surrounded by the quiet beauty of the Texas night, John felt grateful. Grateful for the opportunity to make a difference, grateful for the support of loved ones, and grateful for the simple joy of driving his old truck with its familiar message boldly displayed: Jesus saves. To John, it wasn't just a decal anymore. It was proof that freedom lived on, carried forward by those brave enough to stand up for it.